Firing began, and it seemed like a mighty battle in wartime. The shrieks and screams of children, of mothers, of wives were heard, such as caused the blood of the most inhuman person to creep. Thousands of women, children, and men rushed to the swamps and there lay upon the earth in the cold to freeze and starve. The woods were filled with colored people. The streets were dotted with their dead bodies. A white gentleman said that he saw 10 bodies lying in the undertaker's office at one time. Some of their bodies were left lying in the streets up until the next day following the riot. Some were found by the stench and miasma that came forth from their decaying bodies under their houses. Every colored man who passed through the streets had either to be guarded by one of the crowd or have a paper pass giving him the right to pass. On the morning of November 10th, 1898, an armed mob of white men burned down the editorial office building of a black-owned newspaper called the Daily Record in the city of Wilmington, North Carolina. The action set off several days of terror culminating in a massacre. The newspaper's editor, a man named Alexander Manley, wasn't in town when these events unfolded. While racial tensions had been mounting in the months preceding the massacre, they reached a violent culmination triggered by a newspaper editorial Manley had written that inflamed white supremacists. Manley's editorial had been a response to certain public claims made by a white middle-class Georgia feminist named Rebecca Latimer Felton, who had asserted that black rapists were terrorizing the rural South with impunity and that white men were not protecting their female kin adequately. Felton's rhetoric touched a nerve because it drew upon a number of powerful stereotypes, racist suppositions, and gender ideologies. Felton wrote, "When there is not enough religion in the pulpit to organize a crusade against sin, nor justice in the courthouse to promptly punish crime, nor manhood enough in the nation to put a sheltering arm about innocence and virtue, if it takes lynching to protect women's dearest possession from drunken, ravening human beasts, then I say, lynch 1,000 a week, if it becomes necessary." Lynching was a vigilante action in which someone was killed for an alleged offense without a legal trial, usually by hanging. As a rogue form of justice, the primary victims of lynching were black men. The so-called charges, usually but not always, were for rape, or alleged rape, of a white woman by a black man. Often these accusations led to unlawful apprehension of the alleged perpetrator without legal protection, and hanging by a mob quickly followed. For Felton to call for more lynching directly opposed the activities of anti-lynching campaigners and progressive journalists like Ida B. Wells and many others, and fueled an already out-of-control wave of lynchings in many regions of post-Reconstruction America. Black men could be caught up in this wave of mob justice on the slightest pretext. Merely consorting with an unaccompanied white woman, or greeting a white woman too enthusiastically for the taste of the white population, could incite the call for a lynching. In actuality, even cases of consensual love, friendship, or sexual relations between races could easily turn into false accusations of rape and subsequent hanging. From this perspective of built-in abuses, lynching often became a violent mechanism of political and social control, and a method of regulating interracial procreation in the name of white supremacism. This practice plays a central role in the novel The Marrow of Tradition, when the loyal servant Sandy Campbell is accused of the rape and murder of an elderly white woman, Polly Ochiltree. With regard to the regulatory effect of lynching, there is also the imperative to sustain a crucial fantasy on the part of the dominant white race throughout the southern states who had formerly made up the defeated Confederacy. That fantasy had to do with the preservation of white Southern womanhood, by which was meant the purity of virginity, but also the unadulterated lineage of the white race. It is a fantasy because the historical record provides ample evidence of sexual and romantic relationships between white masters and their black slaves before the Civil War. Lynching, of course, happened to other groups as well, but almost certainly not to the degree they did to black men in the South. And not just black men, but black women as well. At the turn of the century, only 3 years following the publication of The Marrow of Tradition, racial violence of this type was all too common. In 1904, the brutal torture and murder of a black Mississippi husband and wife became sensational fodder for newspapers throughout the country. One paper put it in these graphic terms. When the 2 Negroes were captured, they were tied to trees, and while the funeral pyres were being prepared, they were forced to suffer the most fiendish tortures. The blacks were forced to hold out their hands, while 1 finger at a time was chopped off. The fingers were distributed as souvenirs. The ears of the murderers were cut off. Holbert was severely beaten, his skull was fractured, and one of his eyes knocked out with a stick, hung by a shred from the socket. Neither the man nor the woman begged for mercy, nor made a groan or plea. When the executioners came forward to lop off fingers, Holbert extended his hand without being asked. The most excruciating form of punishment consisted in the use of a large corkscrew in the hands of some of the mob. The instrument was bored into the flesh of the man and the woman, in the arms, legs, and body, and then pulled out, the spirals tearing out big pieces of raw, quivering flesh every time it was withdrawn. Even this devilish torture did not make the poor brutes cry out. When finally they were thrown on the fire and allowed to be burned to death, this came as a relief to the maimed and suffering victims. Returning to the historical event upon which the Marrow of Tradition is based, Alexander Manly's response to Rebecca Latimer Felton's call for more lynchings of black men was understandable given the sheer injustice and horror that came with such sporadic acts of violence. His response, however, inflamed deep-seated anxieties among white supremacists. Manly wrote, "Our experience among poor white people in the country teaches us that the women of that race are not any more particular in the matter of clandestine meetings with colored men than are the white men with colored women. Meetings of this kind go on for some time until the woman's infatuation or the man's boldness bring attention to them and the man is lynched for rape." Manly had dared to suggest that white women could be complicit or consenting with regard to their relations with black men. Even to suggest that Southern women experienced sexual desire and attraction was a radical thing to propose, especially in the face of the carefully constructed sexual and gender ideology of white female purity. To give an example of the forms this ideology assumed in popular culture, here are the lyrics of a song that were reprinted in a white-owned newspaper called The Wilmington Messenger from 1898. "Rise, ye sons of Carolina, proud Caucasians one and all, be not deaf to love's appealing, hear your wives and daughters call, note their blanched and anxious faces, note their frail but lovely forms, rise, defend their spotless virtue with your strong and manly arms." What's so curious to many students of the Wilmington riot that Chesnutt made the subject of his historical novel is the mixture of political aggression with a racist ideology based upon sexuality and family relations. Chesnutt's recasting of these historical events into a novel brilliantly dramatizes this political, sexual intersection, as evidenced by the central role played by interracial family relations in the novel. But the question raised by that centrality is what the actual political conflicts underlying the often melodramatic representation of kinship relations in the novel. Some grasp of the national politics of the time is necessary for appreciating Chesnutt's handling of these themes. The Northern Republican Party, under the leadership of President Abraham Lincoln, initiated the policy of Reconstruction and began to implement these federal laws after Lincoln's assassination in 1865. Throughout the following decade, these laws were intended to reintegrate freed black slaves into the citizenry of the United States. Essentially, this is the same political, historical set of circumstances that we see played out in large portions of Mark Twain's novel, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The policy of Reconstruction was fraught with legislative wrangling, and by 1890 many Northern Republicans lost interest in what was going on with blacks in the South. This political indifference and lack of enforcement opened the doors to white Democratic politicians to pass legislation curtailing the hard-won rights of black folks and instituting segregation policies throughout the South. Restrictions on voting, corruption in the electoral system, and pervasive intimidation kept blacks out of positions of political power and representative government. Some lower-level political offices were held by blacks who demonstrated compliance with the dominant white class. The most significant and wide-ranging contributor to the erosion of black civil rights in the United States at the time occurred in 1896 with the landmark Supreme Court decision known as Plessy v. Ferguson, a case that upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation laws for public facilities as long as the segregated facilities were equal in quality. The doctrine came to be known as separate but equal. Its effect was to legitimize the many state laws reestablishing racial segregation that had been passed in the aftermath of the Reconstruction era, spanning the years 1865 to 1877. The decision involved a case that originated in 1892, when a man named Homer Plessy, an octoroon, which means a person of 7/8 white and 1/8 black ancestry, who was also a resident of New Orleans, deliberately violated Louisiana's Separate Car Act of 1890, which required equal but separate train car accommodations for white and non-white passengers. Something like this scenario plays out in the 5th chapter of the Marrow of Tradition, in which Dr. William Miller, an educated black man, boards a southbound train in the city of Philadelphia, where he encounters a white colleague who is also traveling to Wellington, the fictional city in North Carolina that's based upon the real city of Wilmington. The two cultured gentlemen join each other for a friendly conversation. As the train continues its southward journey, the conductor, reluctant to enforce the train company's segregation policies, asks Miller to move his seat to an empty car marked colored. In the actual Supreme Court case that forms the historical background of a scene like this one, Homer Plessy refused to comply with the policy of separate cars for black passengers on the New Orleans Railroad that he had boarded. His action was deliberately planned to test the constitutionality of such segregation policies. Once he was charged for the violation, his lawyers defended him by arguing that the law was unconstitutional. He lost at trial, and his conviction was affirmed on his appeal to the Louisiana Supreme Court. Plessy then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which agreed to hear his case. In May of 1896, the Supreme Court issued a 7-1 decision against Plessy, ruling that the Louisiana law did not violate the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, stating that although that amendment established the legal equality of white and black Americans, it did not and could not require the elimination of all social or other distinctions based upon color. The court rejected Plessy's lawyers' arguments that the Louisiana law inherently implied that black people were inferior, and gave great deference to American state legislatures' inherent power to make laws regarding health, safety, and morals, the police power, and to determine the reasonableness of the laws they passed. Justice John Marshall Harlan was the lone dissenter from the court's decision, writing that the U.S. Constitution is, quote, colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens, unquote, and so the laws distinguishing of passengers' races should have been found unconstitutional. From 1890 to 1908, state legislatures in the South disenfranchised most blacks and many poor whites through rejecting them for voter registration and voting, making voter registration more difficult by providing more detailed records such as proof of land ownership or literacy tests administered by white staff at poll stations. African American community leaders who had achieved brief political success during the Reconstruction era and even well into the 1880s lost gains made when their voters were excluded from the political system. Against this national background, something additionally consequential was happening on the regional level of Southern politics during the period in which Chesnutt's novel is set. Disenchanted white Democrats who rejected the racist ideology and failed economic policies of their fellow Democrats broke from their own party and formed a political coalition with the Populist Party and with black Republicans. The Populists were generally characterized by their agricultural interests. Together, these three groups combined to bring a new political movement into being called the Fusion Party, which proved to be a fairly strong contender in opposition to the white supremacist wing of the Democratic Party. In fact, the Fusionists had some real successes. The governor of the state of North Carolina was a white Fusionist, and in the state's most important city, Wilmington, many local offices and lower-level political positions were filled by blacks, who were, after all, a majority in this part of the state. But this progress raised violent opposition. When the riots began in Wilmington, the mob not only burned down the office of the black newspaper and destroyed its printing press, they began shooting unarmed blacks in the streets, killing many of them. As the terror spread, frightened blacks abandoned their homes and fled to the nearby swamps to hide out in cold temperatures. Many of them never returned to Wilmington, the population of which became majority white in a matter of days. One other significant thing the rioters did was to throw out of office all the black and fusionist politicians, replacing them with white supremacists from the radical wing of the Democratic Party. They had effectively achieved a coup d'etat that, as the historical record shows, was orchestrated by 9 men. In the novel, Chesnutt reduces this number to 3 people, each of which represents a type. These are Captain McBain, Major Carteret, and General Belmont, each retaining the military rank they held in the defeated Confederate Army.
I jumped aboard the telegraph and traveled down the river. The next big fluid magnified and killed 500 nigger.
Charles Waddell Chesnutt was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1858 and died in 1932. His parents were what was called free persons of color, and it's likely his grandfather had been a white slaveholder. Chesnutt had other white ancestors in all likelihood, but for him, he identified as African American at the same time noting that he was 7/8 white. He could pass, in other words, as a white man, but never chose to do so. In many southern states, he would legally be considered white if he chose to identify that way. But by 1920 in the South, the concept of the one-drop rule was adopted into law, and by that rule, he would legally be designated black. Chesnutt's family moved south to Fayetteville, North Carolina when he was 9, where his parents ran a grocery store. By age 14, Chesnutt was a pupil teacher at the Howard School, one of many schools founded for black students by the Freedmen's Bureau during the Reconstruction era. Historically, young Chesnutt was able to take advantage of these federal programs, But he also lived to experience reversals when Reconstruction collapsed and Jim Crow laws reinstituted segregation throughout the South. He was uniquely placed in time, in other words, and uniquely biracial to create the complexity of racial issues and types we see in the Marrow of Tradition. After he married and moved to New York City, he published a collection of short stories known as The Conjure Woman. Other works of fiction about the color line followed, including The Wife of His Youth and Other Stories of the Color Line, as well as The House Behind the Cedars, and the book we're reading now, The Marrow of Tradition. After 1901, Chesnutt wrote little fiction because he turned his energies towards his court reporting business. An early member of the NAACP, he was a collaborator with W.E.B. Du Bois. It's worth thinking about the meaning of the title Chesnutt selected for this novel. Marrow, of course, is a reference to bone marrow, the innermost life of the human organism, and the pulpy substance within bones that generates blood cells. Blood, both literally and figuratively, is a word with profound significance in the Southern culture Chesnutt is depicting. It is, under law at the time, the measure and indicator of race, and it plays a large role in the concept of lineage that was so central to the identity politics of white supremacists. Many times in the text of the novel, the word blood is used almost interchangeably with family. Sometimes it designates levels of racial purity or adulteration of an imagined racial purity. In a political or ideological context, blood came to designate levels of social, moral, and physical superiority, a method of discrimination that was based upon a discredited pseudoscience and entrenched misapprehension of cultural evolution. The designation of blood percentages of Negro and white characteristics found its way into the legal discourse of the time, which legitimized the racist assumptions that underlied the whole system. In our own time, the racist and xenophobic chant of blood and soil has reemerged in the national discourse with reference to ancient notions of anti-Semitism. Another way Chesnutt is using these powerful terms is to suggest something of the idea of bred in the bone, which means inherent traits or unchangeable dispositions and natures. The idea of white supremacy is one such idea, the dialectical opposite of black inferiority. What Chesnutt is deconstructing here is the biological argument in support of an essentially made-up mythology, or in more contemporary language, an ideology of racial superiority. Chesnutt's own racial composition led him to question this basis of discrimination, and those who unfairly benefited from its effects. The basic argument is that what passes as natural and irreversible is in fact far more complex and improvisational than it appears. Built into the very cast of characters in the novel is ample evidence of the false essentialism undergirding racist arguments such as these. Families are mixed, sisters are racially different, but share the same father. Black men can be brutal or refined, intelligent or simple-minded. Younger black women born after the end of slavery can look contemptuously at older black women like Mammy Jane for her subservient behavior, and so on. Much of the text is a relentless attempt to dismantle racial stereotypes, even while some of the characters fall easily into those categories. The other term in the book's title, tradition, unlike the word marrow, is not the name of an organic substance. It is a word designating an accretion of habitual, shared, collective behaviors, handed down generation after generation. In other words, a man-made cultural phenomenon that, by its very nature, is not essential but changeable, subject to phases of dominance and decay. To put those two words into proximity in the same title offers a contradiction that conflates a man-made ideology, i.e. tradition, with a highly suggestive, organic, or natural image, marrow. One of the classic definitions of the term ideology is false consciousness. With this in mind, The title of the novel seems deeply ironic, especially given the way the novel consistently dismantles the false connection between nature and ideology. Chesnutt undermines the reader's instantaneous grasp of this stereotypical use of characters by emphasizing the complexity of other characters who cannot so easily be fitted into those roles because they are dramatized at a particular historical moment in which they are evolving out of those roles into a fuller humanity. The opening of the novel establishes this evolution at the very outset. The novel begins with a woman in labor, but a particular kind of woman, a white Southern woman who is married to a man named Major Carteret, who is himself from a formerly wealthy and socially prominent family. His ancestors, we learn, had owned an estate of 90,000 acres of land and 6,000 slaves. When we meet Major Carteret some 20 years after the end of the Civil War, he is in much reduced circumstances. As Chesnutt tells us, his family has been much impoverished by the war, even their ancestral home swallowed up in the common ruin. His elder brother had sacrificed his life on the bloody altar of the lost cause, and his father, broken and chagrined, died not many years later. He had tried in various pursuits to gain a foothold in the new life, but with indifferent success until he won the hand of Olivia Merkel, whom he had seen grow from a small girl to glorious womanhood. With her money he founded the Morning Chronicle, which he had made the leading organ of his party and the most influential paper in the state. The fine old house in which they lived was hers. In this very room she had first drawn the breath of life. It had been their nuptial chamber, and here, too, within a few hours, she might die, for it seemed impossible that one could long endure such frightful agony and live. Of course, the immediate cause of this life-threatening situation is that she is having her first child somewhat too late in life, presumably after a number of failed attempts to conceive. The moment of birth is shadowed by death. The heir to the inheritance of this family is teetering on the line between life and death, as if everything the child represents is susceptible to a kind of annihilation. One of the notable things about this couple has to do with a reversal of traditional gender roles, especially as that relates to kinship structures and lines of succession. Instead of a patrilinear or male line of succession, we have what is essentially a matrilinear or female one. Disempowered by the fact that his family was on the losing side of the war, Carteret acquires compensatory economic capital from the woman he marries. It's her house, and the very room they occupy has been the primal scene of an unfolding female history. She also supplies her husband with the capital to establish a newspaper dedicated to propagating white supremacist policies and ideology, which in effect places Southern women squarely within the political arena as enablers and in some cases as agitators. If you think about the actual case of the inflammatory editorial we looked at, written by the Georgia woman who advocated lynching scores of black men, you see what we mean. We have to keep in mind, however, how unusual this circumstance is, and how it probably fuels Carteret's sense of wounded pride, humiliation, and sense of emasculation. The child is not only his heir, but the last and only chance to ensure his family name will live on. Dr. Price, once the baby is born, warns Carteret that his wife can bear no more. Despite these incontrovertible facts, Carteret and the other white supremacists believe in the patriarchal privilege of masculinity. General Belmont, Captain McBain, and even the sympathetic Ellis all share the belief in the evolutionary superiority of the white race in particular. Just to be sure that we know the terms of that belief and where it comes from, remember that by the late 19th century, the theory of evolution and the descent of man, proffered by Charles Darwin, had not only become a controversial element of the general culture, but had continually morphed into ideas that were less scientific than they were in service to racist and, in some cases, more progressive ideologies. The biggest single impact on Darwinian thought was made by a prolific English theorist and social commentator named Herbert Spencer. It is Spencer who coined the term we most associate with Darwin, survival of the fittest, which Darwin adopted into his work on natural selection. Spencer essentially took what Darwin had discovered about plant and animal life to social life and human populations. This is why we use the term social Darwinism to describe the kinds of ideas that we find in Chesnutt's novel. Terms such as race, civilization, degeneracy, superiority, brutal, savage, primitive, advanced, etc., all form part of a vast discourse of social evolution. And it gets more complicated at the close of the 19th century with variations on the theme of decadence. An 1890 book, for instance, by a man named Max Nordau called Degeneration claimed to find evidence of moral rot in the aesthetic movement going on in literature and the arts in the late 1890s. As these theories proliferated, they led into more nefarious territory, including things like facial recognition of criminality, regression, recidivism, atavism, which means the resurgence of primitive traits that break through the veil of cultural refinement, and modern eugenics, the attempt to identify, manipulate, and preserve racial purity. The horrific culmination of this insidious evolutionary logic occurred between the rise of Nazism in 1933 to the liberation of the concentration camps in 1945. Returning to our text, I want to emphasize two things. First, how astutely Chesnutt captures this ideology of racial purity, and how equally brilliantly he undermines its basic assumptions. At the beginning of chapter 13, for example, a party of northern visitors to the St. James Hotel convey their sentiments about Southern blacks, and in doing so, they provide us with a baseline of these kinds of beliefs. They get, of course, a typical white Southerners' view of the freed black people that they are seeing on their trip. I'll read the passage. As soon as their desire for information became known, they were taken courteously under the wing of prominent citizens and their wives, who gave them at elaborate luncheons the Southern white man's views of the Negro, sighing sentimentally over the disappearance of the good old Negro of before the war, and gravely deploring the degeneracy of his descendants. They enlarged upon the amount of money the Southern whites had spent for the education of the Negro, and shook their heads over the inadequate results accruing from this unexampled generosity. It was sad, they said, to witness this spectacle of a dying race, unable to withstand the competition of a superior type. Northerners, of course, would be predisposed to be very critical of Southern slavery and its heritage. But the Southerners that they encounter in this scene are trying to make a racist argument about the imperviousness of blacks to education, using the popular language of pseudoscientific evolutionary discourse with phrases like a dying race and degeneracy. A kind of counter-argument in Chesnutt's novel is represented, of course, in instances of the great capacity of blacks to educate themselves, as well as any other people, especially if you consider the example of Dr. William Miller and his wife Janet, and even the young nurse that he trains in his hospital. Carteret's response to this kind of counter-evidence is pure fantasy. When old Mr. Delamere points to the example of the rising Miller family, Carteret falls back upon a knee-jerk defense, and I quote, "You are mistaken, sir, in imagining me hostile to the Negro," he says on page 25. "Oh, on the contrary, I am friendly to his best interests. I give him employment. I pay taxes for schools to educate him, and for courthouses and jails to keep him in order." I merely object to being governed by an inferior and servile race, end quote. Even the well-meaning Mr. Ellis appears of a similar mind, as we see in this passage. Quote, Ellis had never pretended to that intimate knowledge of Negro thought and character by which some of his acquaintances claimed the ability to fathom every motive of a Negro's conduct and predict in advance what any one of the darker races would do under a given set of circumstances. He would not have believed that a white man could possess two so widely varying phases of character, but as to Negroes, they were as yet a crude and undeveloped race, and it was not safe to make predictions concerning them. No one could tell at what moment the thin veneer of civilization might peel off and reveal the underlying savage. Unquote. There is, of course, an exquisite irony in this response, because even though Ellis is espousing racist notions of inferiority, he's doing so while watching Tom Delamere disguised as Sandy Campbell. This irony opens the way for one of Chesnutt's powerful counter-arguments, which emerges in his depiction of certain brutal instincts in white people who otherwise seem hyper-civilized. In fact, refinement and racial purity seems itself to lead to a kind of degeneration, as we see in Chesnutt's depiction of Mr. Delamere's grandson, Tom. If Tom is the flower of civilization, it's a strange flower indeed. When we first meet him, he's described this way. Slender and of medium height, with a small head of almost perfect contour, a symmetrical face, dark almost to swarthiness, black eyes which moved somewhat restlessly, curly hair of raven tint, a slight mustache, small hands and feet, and fashionable attire. Tom Delamere, the grandson of the old gentleman who had already arrived, was easily the handsomest young man in Wellington, but no discriminating observer would have characterized his beauty as manly. It conveyed no impression of strength, but did possess a certain element, feline rather than feminine, which subtly negatived the idea of manliness. Likewise, that other flower of Southern womanhood, Polly Ochiltree, is described as having a frankness, quote, that sometimes bordered on brutality, end quote. Most startling of all, Chesnutt turns the tables on the degeneracy debate by clearly placing Tom Delamere in that category. While he is losing at cards with Captain McBain, whom he considers socially beneath him, Chesnutt writes, and I quote, Delamere winced at the familiarity. He had reached that degree of moral deterioration where, while principles were of little moment, the externals of social intercourse possessed an exaggerated importance, end quote. Speaking of McBain, from an evolutionary perspective, his physical description, even though he claims privilege as a white man, indicates something far more primitive, and I quote, a single deep-set gray eye was shadowed by a beetling brow, over which a crop of coarse black hair, slightly streaked with gray, fell almost low enough to mingle with his black, bushy eyebrows, unquote. Perhaps the most explicit counter-argument, however, has to do with Dr. Miller himself, who becomes a focal point, I think, for the thoughtful, conflicted reader of the book. In a moment of focalization in which we are allowed to enter into Miller's thinking without his having said anything out loud, we have a debunking of the racist myth of evolution. In the following passage, you'll see.
Was it not, after all, a wise provision of nature that had given to a race destined to a long servitude and a slow emergence therefrom a cheerfulness of spirit which enabled them to catch pleasure on the wing and endure with equanimity the ills that seemed inevitable? The ability to live and thrive under adverse circumstances is the surest guarantee of the future. The race which at the last shall inherit the earth, the residuary legatee of civilization, will be the race which remains longest upon it. The Negro was here before the Anglo-Saxon was evolved, and his thick lips and heavy-lidded eyes looked out from the inscrutable face of the Sphinx across the sands of Egypt, while yet the ancestors of those who now oppress him were living in caves, practicing human sacrifice, and painting themselves with woad, and the Negro is here yet. Returning to the novel's opening scene, with this background of family lineage and historical context of evolution and degeneration, Chesnutt's choice of beginning with a troubled pregnancy and a precarious birth is entirely apt. As readers, we look in on people poised between the promise of new life and the very real possibility of extinction, exactly the situation we find ourselves in at the close of the novel. But there is something particularly ominous about the crisis we encounter in these opening pages because of the kind of people caught up in it. For the woman in labor, this is her first child, conceived presumably after some extended period of difficulty. This will be, according to her physician's confidential talk with her husband, the last child she will have because of complications of her age. She gives birth to a male child, which is significant in regard to his continuing the family name and lineage. And, of course, this is a white child, born into the privileges attending his race and social status. While Chesnutt emphasizes the continuity of life in this scene, we must also understand what a crucial point this is in family history, the transmission of wealth and property, the perpetuation of patriarchal masculinity and white racial dominance. And because Mrs. Carteret's baby represents all this, the threats to Dodie's survival become all the more momentous and interesting. Old Mr. Delamere captures the real significance of this event when he says, "Ah, young gentleman, you cannot appreciate except in imagination what it means to one standing on the brink of eternity to feel sure that he will live on in his children and his children's children." What's at stake in this event, in other words, is the preservation of the white race itself, and what threatens that self-interested preservation is its own denial of the mutual humanity and dependence of the black upon the white races. The threats to Theodore Felix Carteret's young life are plenty. He's born with an ominous mole behind his ear. A cat tries to suck out his breath. He swallows part of an old ivory rattle given to him by Polly Ochiltree. He just barely avoids going under the surgeon's knife to dislodge the rattle from his throat. He slips from Clara's arms and nearly falls out of a window, lured by the notes of a nearby mockingbird. Many of his threats affect the neck and throat area, suggesting a hanging or choking that may echo being lynched. Even his nickname seems ill-advised, if one reads Dodie as do die. Another thing Major Carteret has at stake in the birth of his son is the reassertion of a masculine dominance that has been severely compromised. Carteret's financial security comes from his wife's family. It is her money that capitalizes the newspaper he edits, called the Morning Chronicle. In addition to this, we learn the fine old house in which they lived was hers. What's become of the Carteret family to have left Major Carteret so impoverished? His former home is now occupied by a young, educated black physician named Miller and his wife, Janet. This source of resentment for Carteret links his diminished sense of masculine privilege with racial hatred, but it's even more overdetermined than that. Miller's wife, Janet, is Olivia Carteret's half-sister. Her father, Samuel Merkel, has a child with a black former servant named Julia after his first wife dies. Soon after this, he dies suddenly, and his sister-in-law Polly Ochiltree throws Julia out of the house. There are two babies at the beginning of the novel, the white child known as Dodie and the infant son of William and Janet Miller. The white boy struggles to be born, and his infancy is under almost continual threat of extinction.
At stake in the preservation of each of these children is the transmission of wealth, name, and property rights, just as it was for Julia's child, Janet, after her husband's death. Likewise, Olivia Carteret's inheritance from that same father has been secured illegally by Polly Ochiltree's theft of a marriage license and will. This tainted inheritance appears to manifest itself in Dodie's fragile birth. Given the biological and familial interconnections that cannot be denied between the daughters of Samuel Merkel, the purity of whiteness, or of blackness for that matter, is not only an impossibility, but is revealed as a historical and ideological construct. Moreover, blackness and whiteness must exist as a dialectical concept in which one racial designation must mutually construct the other, sustaining distinctions dependent upon the paradox of negative identification. Considering Charles Chesnutt's own personal experience of a mixed-race lineage, as well as the wide range of skin tones expressed by many characters in the novel, it is all the more remarkable how insightful the book is about the interdependency of different races and the performative element of racial identification. To take the most obvious example of this, consider the passages in which Tom Delamere blackens his face and wears Sandy Campbell's clothes to participate in that form of entertainment known in black culture as the cakewalk dance. With scenes like this one, Chesnutt seems to be suggesting the detachability and appropriation of racial identity, making it something less inherent or essentialist than the times would suggest. In fact, Chesnutt goes even further by revealing all the ways the signs of color and racial difference not only work to drive people away from each other, but how they also create an absence on both sides of that spectrum that generates a desire for reconnection, even if that reconnection takes the form of an appropriation or the inhabiting of a different persona. Another way to put this is to see the false exclusivity of white supremacy and white identity as a product of recognizing and even creating its own difference from itself, as a way of sustaining an idea of what it is not instead of an idea of what it essentially is. Chesnutt not only perceives the underlying power dynamic in these dialectical racial relations, but turns it on its head to reinscribe it as mutual survival. The result is a whole series of character doublings, a white baby and black baby representing alternative futures, a white sister and black sister who share the same father, a white man, Samuel Merkel, married to the black woman Julia, and the mutual dependency demonstrated by old Mr. Delamere and his beloved servant and surrogate son, Sandy Campbell.
Ties of butter and peppermint, I'll cut you down in the flower of your youth, you Jimmy. Take your partners for the cakewalk. Come down.
In order to dramatize the performative aspects of racial identity, to reveal its unstable foundations, Chesnutt turns to the cakewalk dance, a centuries-old and still evolving cultural practice grown straight out of black slave folk culture. Just as the cakewalk dance was appropriated by whites in black-faced minstrelsy shows, Chesnutt reappropriates this cultural tradition into his own cultural production of the novel. What does this mean, though? Secondly, what's the intersection of racial and personal identity? Is it possible, Chesnutt seems to imply, to know the individual self outside the racialized self, or is one's race just another component of self-identity? There's a question here as well. What is lost when one's sense of self is reduced to race? What value is provided by accepting difference as an integral component of self? To give a concrete example of this, look at the passage about Sandy Campbell's confusion in the chapter called Sandy Sees His Own Haunt. When Sandy was going home about 11 o'clock, 3 sheets in the wind, such was the potent effect of the single drink and those which had followed it, he was scared almost into soberness by a remarkable apparition. As it seemed to Sandy, he saw himself hurrying along in front of himself toward the house. Possibly the muddled condition of Sandy's intellect had so affected his judgment as to vitiate any conclusion he might draw. But Sandy was quite sober enough to perceive that the figure ahead of him wore his best clothes and looked exactly like him, but seemed to be in something more of a hurry, a discrepancy which Sandy at once corrected by quickening his own pace so as to maintain as nearly as possible an equal distance between himself and his double. The situation was certainly an incomprehensible one, and savored of the supernatural. Several observations are possible about this passage. First, whatever sense of self is being dramatized here is obviously not a single or unified self, and this causes Sandy discomfort. He's not aware at first, or in control of this other self, who's doing things outside Sandy's own will, and behaving in ways that Sandy will nevertheless be held responsible for. We can account for this doubleness in all people who have, say, no control over what other people think or know about us, or the experience of playing a social role that may differ from our notion of a private self that is to us inviolable. But this seems radically different because Sandy does not have the choice or option of owning this doubled self. It's been stolen from him and paraded in the most exaggerated, demeaning way. Moreover, Sandy conceives of the double as a ghost or a haunt, suggesting he's been killed. Ghosts are about the past, usually an uncomfortable and painful past. So this haunt that Sandy observes carries the weight of a burdened history, perhaps the history of slavery itself that has so recently afflicted his people. The whole enactment of this robbery of identity muddles Sandy's thinking with regard to knowing who and what he is, which is perhaps Chesnutt's most damning indictment of the deep psychological scars of racism. An important thing to keep in mind is the background meaning and implication of the folk tradition of the cakewalk as it evolved into a mainstream form of popular culture throughout the last decades of the 19th into the 20th century. Some of you may know about blackface as an offensive throwback to negative stereotypes, but even in the 1920s we have in vaudeville and early film the residual content of these appropriated cultural forms, as in Al Jolson's film The Jazz Singer. Remember, too, the parodic elements of the original cakewalk dances among slaves, as well as the elements of resistance and deference woven into these performances. When you factor in the composition of the audience, from, say, fellow slaves or black folks in early instances to largely white audiences, you begin to see the complexity of the dynamics. Then you have white audience members eventually joining the performance side of this equation in blackface, which means that white folks are performing for other white folks in black disguise. You have to wonder about the reasons for this aggressive appropriation of black folk culture by white folks, but also wonder about the necessity of inhabiting an artificial black skin while doing it. The question arises, what is the black mask, as it were, mediating? What cultural work is being done in this mediation? Is it in service to perpetuating racism, or is it a rather tortured acknowledgement of a dialectical sense of identity? Given the complex and suggestive history of the cakewalk and blackface minstrelsy, a student of literature would want to ask about Chesnutt's reappropriation of this cultural phenomenon into the art of the novel. In other words, when one artistic form, the novel, absorbs within it a very different cultural form, the folkloric cakewalk dance, what meanings may be emerging from this interaction? Before I make some remarks by way of conclusion about the Marrow of Tradition, let me just review some important plot details from the middle to the end of the novel. Sandy Campbell is exonerated for the robbery and assault on Mrs. Ogletree through the determined intervention of his master, Mr. Delamere. Delamere's interview with Ellis and his pleading with Carteret are barely enough to save Sandy from a vicious lynching and burning, but he is saved. Delamere's own search of Tom's room reveals evidence of his blackface disguise, as well as a gold coin found under the dresser. The old man concludes that his own grandson is responsible for the robbery and murder of Polly Ochiltree. Nothing is done about arresting Tom Delamere. Justice fails because race and class trump the law. Crime goes unpunished because of an implied cognitive dissonance between the mob's bloodlust and the intolerable fact that one of the finest of their own race was responsible for the crime. Delamere calls upon General Belmont to draw up a new will that leaves Sandy $3,000 and donates the remainder of his estate to Dr. Miller's Black Hospital. General Belmont, contravening Delamere's wishes after his death, fails to produce this will. Racist imperatives prevail in the disposal of the old man's wealth. Meanwhile, Olivia Carteret discovers among her late aunt's papers a folder that contains her father's will, which leaves Julia and Janet half his wealth and property. She burns the will, but as it burns, some lines of print come into view like the photographic negative, an echo of the signs on the passenger cars of the train that takes Dr. Miller and Dr. Burns from Philadelphia to North Carolina. The line suggests Merkel has a second wife, and indeed Olivia finds a marriage certificate which she also destroys. A third document is discovered, a letter written by Samuel Merkel to Mr. Delamere, which is reprinted in its entirety in the text of the novel. This document tells the real story of Merkel's marriage to Julia and his wishes for her and their child. All of this precipitates a crisis of conscience in Olivia, but she decides not to correct the injustice by not divulging the existence of the will. Quote, she had to confront a situation involving the element of race upon which the moral standards of her people were hopelessly confused. Mrs. Carteret reached the conclusion ere daylight dawned that she would be silent upon the subject of her father's second marriage. Unquote. The novel oscillates between recounting the historical political events of the Wilmington Massacre and the family drama that begins to unfold, a generic mix of melodrama and realism. As the novel reaches its conclusion, the family of William Miller and Major Carteret are drawn together as if by fate. In addition, the political dimension of the novel becomes even more tightly intertwined with the private family drama, collapsing the distinction between these so-called separate spheres. And finally, the two races are brought into a seemingly inevitable relationship to each other that gets embodied in the mixed-race figure of Janet Miller mourning the death of her only child. This child is the first to die. Major Carteret, General Belmont, and Captain McBain plot to reprint the inflammatory editorial to arouse resentment and outrage against the black imputation of white injustice. They agitate throughout the state, representing the Democratic Party in its opposition to the Republicans and the Fusionists. Their goal is to intercede in the next elections, scaring or discouraging blacks from voting. In fact, what they want is total disenfranchisement of the blacks and a political coup that will win back white dominance. They overthrow the municipal government and start an armed conflict that terrorizes prominent black businessmen and holders of office. Josh Green decides to arm a small band of blacks to defend black property rights. He takes up a position inside Dr. Miller's hospital, having forced the cowardly Jerry to join him and about a dozen others. Meanwhile, violence escalates out of control as Dr. Miller travels frantically through the town in search of his wife. Various innocents are killed, including Mammy Jane, who cries out to her mistress as she dies, and Auntie Letlow. Doty develops a deadly croup, but no white doctors can be found to perform the dangerous operation on his throat. Finally, Carteret concedes he needs Dr. Miller's assistance. Again, the emphasis here is on interdependence. The hospital is burned to the ground. Josh Green manages to kill McBain before he dies, McBain having killed Josh's father and driven his mother mad. All of the men who accompanied Josh are shot down by the white mob. Carteret goes to Miller's home to find him grieving over his dead son. Miller refuses to attend to the dying Dodie. Carteret returns home. Olivia rushes out into the night to plead with Miller to save her child. Miller leaves the decision to his grieving wife. After severe resistance to her half-sister's appeals, Janet finally agrees to let her husband go to Dodie. Olivia reveals the existence of the will and the marriage certificate. A kind of reconciliation then takes place. To begin making sense of these details, let's consider some of Chesnutt's broader concerns as an African-American writer. To what extent does his work compare, say, with and differ from that of his contemporaries, especially the writer W.E.B. Du Bois? One similarity between them seems to be in Chesnutt's use of the metaphor of the veil to describe the blindness of racial discrimination. Looking at the late chapter entitled Fiat Justitia, we have an explicit reference to this veil imagery. In the agony of his own predicament, in the horror of the situation at Miller's house, for a moment the veil of race prejudice was rent in twain, and he, Carteret, saw things as they were, in their correct proportions and relations, saw clearly and convincingly that he had no standing here in the presence of death in the home of this stricken family. The metaphor of the veil was used to powerful effect in 1903's The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. In a chapter called Of Our Spiritual Strivings, Du Bois wrote, "After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." Du Bois continues, "The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world and Africa. He would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American, without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face." We can draw several conclusions about the difference between Chesnutt's use of the veil imagery and Du Bois's. In Chesnutt, the veil imagery extends to white people as well. Carteret, for instance, is the one who's been blinded by prejudice. Note in the second half of Du Bois's statement the allusion to bleaching. We can think of the character of Jerry, who longs to be white and who in effect damages his face until it's mottled and becomes neither black nor white. What does Du Bois mean by the second identity of American in the passage we looked at? Is it a legal category of citizenship, or is it something outside the law? In Chesnutt, blacks are being denied the rights of citizenship, the right to operate profitable businesses, the right to pursue happiness or inherit property. That would seem to exclude them from one definition of Americanness. And finally, with all the references we've seen in the novel to racial interdependence for survival, Double consciousness doesn't quite fit as a description of what goes into the identity construction of both whites and blacks. They seem more mutually constitutive, even though the white characters cherish a false notion of essential purity in the marrow of tradition. Turning now to the meaning of the chapter title, Fiat Justitia, we see that in Latin this translates into Let Justice Be Done. This chapter comes after a series of incidents in the novel in which the rule of law, which is conventionally thought to ensure that justice be done for all, has consistently failed. For example, lynching as a perversion of the justice system that happens outside the purview of written law. The subversion of legal wills by women like Mrs. Ochiltree and Olivia Carteret, who exert their feminine power to undermine the wills of a man, Samuel Merkel, and General Belmont's failure to disclose Mr. Delamere's final will and testament. What we have here is a general failure of the word, the document, the very language of the law. Documents in the text of the novel are vulnerable to misinterpretation, destruction, subversion, as if the law itself is no longer viable, trusted, or at all efficacious in the administration of justice. We have in its place a kind of justice that eludes articulation in print, a kind of nonverbal justice born of violence and murder, almost Old Testament in the way the novel concludes with the near possibility of sacrificing one innocent life for another. This erosion in the confidence of writing, or special kinds of writing in particular, such as legal discourse, creates a vacuum that is filled by literary discourse, by the novel itself as a commentary on justice or on history. We see this deterioration's cause in a passage like this one. To meet words with words upon such a subject would be to acknowledge the equality of the Negro and his right to discuss or criticize the conduct of the white people. Civilized discourse, the ability to enter into it, constitutes full personhood. This is to implicate words in the designation of citizenship, but also basic humanity. It's a logocentric or reason-based element of the person. What's taken away from such characters thought to be unworthy of civilized exchange of words is given back by their representation in the novel.